are going to be talking about herbs for the next hour. I am thrilled to be with you here today. Herbs are probably my favorite thing in the garden and outside of the garden and in the kitchen and just about anywhere. I adore and love herbs. I am sharing with you the definition of herbs. Sometimes I get people asking me, what exactly are herbs? And so I went to the Herb Society of America, a great resource for anybody if you're interested in learning more about herbs. But this is how they define herbs. And it's basically a small seed-bearing plant. It can include trees and shrubs, but typically it's more fleshy rather than woody. And anything that is any plant that is valued for flavor, fragrance, medicinal, economic, you read the whole description here. I think you have looked through the definition. It's just amazing. So basically I just say herbs are, if you have a use for it, you're probably talking about, and you can categorize that plant as an herb. All right, we're gonna move kind of quickly today. I usually am more interactive in taking questions and letting the conversation flow a little bit, but since we're remote, I'm just going to move forward and we'll see where we land. The first thing I always say is, why on earth would you want to grow fresh herbs? We have wonderful grocery stores. We can go get dried herbs. We can get fresh herbs at the grocery store, but why grow them? And I think this is a great picture. It shows you the beautiful qualities of fresh. This is an example of parsley, and look at the beautiful green of the fresh plant versus dried. So I know that we have in our very cold climate in Minnesota, it's always wonderful to have access to dried herbs through the winter months, but once the growing season is upon us, it's super fun to just be able to go out to your yard and collect the fresh, real thing. It's always got a lot more nutritional benefits as well as a lot more flavor and just a lot more fun in general. So we're going to talk a little bit about herbs in general. This is kind of a pretty basic. I want to talk about how, and then we're going to talk when. So how do we grow herbs in general? So I have some general rules of thumb. This is one that trips up a lot of people, especially in our beautiful shaded neighborhoods in the Twin Cities and beyond. It's kind of hard sometimes to find enough sun to grow herbs, but this is definitely one category of plants that you will want to find and identify a minimum of 6 to 8 hours a day, and preferably morning to night sun. Herbs love the sun, they soak it up, and you will find and reap the benefits of placing them in the sunniest spots in your yard. They honestly really just require average soil conditions. So this is something where you don't really have to have enriched soil. You don't have to sit there and try and get that beautiful loamy that a lot of our perennial flowers really enjoy and like. Herbs can kind of be neglected. And in fact, a lot of our culinary herbs enjoy and benefit from poor soil, if you will. They also benefit from not having too much moisture in the yard. So you really can benefit from growing herbs. They do appreciate getting dried out thoroughly before waterings. There are a couple of exceptions. We'll talk about those. But average moisture in the garden. So this is not something where you have to baby them and give them a lot of extra and special care. They enjoy those dry periods. And here we go again. Isn't this awesome? Herbs are like the easiest things to grow. Don't over fertilize them. A little is okay, as I put on the screen, but you basically want to not fertilize them. Why is that? It's because for culinary and for growing herbs and enjoying the benefits of them for taste and fragrance and medicinal qualities, in general, those things are activated by a little bit of neglect. So that's kind of where you're not too much moisture, not too great of a soil, and not too much fertilizer. All those things add up and let the herbs kind of grow and get stressed out a little bit, and that enhances those qualities that we're looking for, that wonderful taste and flavor. And like I said, if you're into the medicinal herbs, that's what brings out those medicinal qualities. So it's not like we're deliberately trying to stress the plant, but we kind of are. And again, the average moisture is great, But here we go, let dry out before watering. A lot of our culinary herbs are really from Mediterranean climate, and that is going back to think about very dry, rocky soil. So if you kind of learn where the herbs come from and then try and stimulate that in our gardens, sometimes that's kind of difficult in Minnesota, but we can kind of trick our herbs into thinking they're enjoying that sunny Mediterranean climate sometimes. All right, we're going to move on to let's talk when to grow them. And I just want to put up here, I've done a lot of classes on all of these things, but we'll just do a little, nod to them at this time. So we can extend the season by growing seeds in a greenhouse. If you don't have a greenhouse, you can use your own house. And these are what we're talking about when you go to your nurseries and garden centers, getting seed trays and being able to buy seeds and then starting them indoors. And I do a lot of that. In fact, the beginning of March is a great time to start doing that. Your garden centers will be fully stocked right now. And you just want to look at the back of the packet. Typically, a lot of your herbs will want 6 to 8 weeks ahead of time for when you're transplanting to out of doors. So if you just figure out an optimal planting date, which is pretty much typically mid-May to late May, and then back up about 6 weeks, that's a good time to start them indoors. That's your greenhouse. The milk jug method is something that is fun. It was had a lot of success and popularity a few years ago, but it's basically taking your milk jugs that are empty from milk. They have to be the opaque ones that can let sunlight through. Cut them open, put your soil in there, put seeds in it, tape it up, and throw it out into a snowbank with the lid off. And that kind of is a way to germinate them when Mother Nature wants to have them germinate. And it's kind of a lazy man's method of the greenhouse or starting seeds indoors. On to direct sowing. That simply is a term that refers to seeds that you put directly into the ground. And where you want them to grow, that's where you're going to put the seeds instead of trying to transplant. And that can be either for containers or in the ground. And then successive sow is a term I use, and it's a very successful technique with a couple of our very popular herbs. We'll get to them, which is cilantro and dill. And I do a lot of that. So successive sow refers to having a seed packet and actually sowing, direct sowing into containers or the ground, but not sowing all of your seeds, actually sowing and then a couple of weeks later, sowing again or putting more seeds in the ground, and do that every couple of weeks. So you have a successive crop, as it were. And then if you're going to buy plants at the garden centers, nurseries, the only tip I'll give you for that is it's a very successful way to get a jump start on a lot of our herbs that have more difficulty starting from seed. They grow very slowly. And so, gosh, it's easy. It's better to buy them as a little small 4-inch plant to transplant. And if you're going to do that, just be aware of, in general, any plant coming from a nursery needs to go through a hardening off process. And that is a process of acclimating them from the indoor greenhouse where it's all perfect conditions, lots of sunshine, but it's protected from the elements. And then you have to get them acclimated to outdoors. And that's just a process of a few hours each day increasing. So day one, you don't want to bring it outside during the daytime hours, keep it in the shade for a couple of days, then introduce it into a few hours morning of full sun, and then successively increase your hours of direct sunshine on the plant. And in a few days, you'll have them ready to plant directly into the ground or containers, wherever you want to put your herbs. And then we're going to talk where. So basically, in the ground is a great place for herbs. I love to put my herbs and put them into my perennial gardens. It's sometimes not where you think of putting herbs. A lot of people like to have it in a kitchen garden or incorporated with their vegetable gardens if they have that. But if you don't have an herb garden or a vegetable garden per se, I tuck them into my landscaping. So I put them into my borders and my side yards, and I'll tuck them into my perennial gardens, and even with my shrub borders. So I integrate my herbs completely into my landscaping. And we'll talk as we go through each individual herb that I've selected to talk about today and share with you. We'll talk about some that are really good landscaping plants and landscaping choices. Vegetable garden, this is a wonderful place to put herbs. They're oftentimes a term used is companion planting. The herbs oftentimes have very wonderful qualities that work very well and create a symbiotic relationship with the vegetables that you like to grow. They can help ward off pests. They can help supply nutrients to certain vegetables. And that's something, if you're interested in it, I would recommend that you get a book or just Google the brain, right, on companion planting, and you will start to find out what goes well with what. It's really a lot of fun and very beneficial if you like to vegetable garden. And then if you have a classic just herb garden, this can be very small or it can be very large. The Master Gardener research, education, and display gardens that we all loved and dealt with in Dakota County for years, I had a semi-formal herb garden, 75 feet long by 25 feet wide. And we used to display and grow, gosh, it was anywhere from 750 to 1,500 herbs every year. And primarily we would start from seed, all of those. So if you don't have that kind of space, and I certainly don't in my own yard, then you can scale it way down and have a little 6x6 plot, or just a border, a nice little sunny spot in your yard, and incorporate that into an herb garden. Well worth the effort, and you get to reap all the benefits of harvesting, and we'll talk about harvesting in a minute as well. If you're going to go into containers, I often recommend, especially if you're kind of new to herb gardening, they lend themselves very well to be put into a container. And I always recommend put them in a sunny spot near an entrance to your home, preferably by the kitchen if you have it. Now, in my situation, I have a kitchen on the south side of my house, but it is a story up, so I have a walkout basement. So when I was really starting into herbs in my present location, I did an awful lot of herbs on the deck in containers. In fact, that's what I was doing. And that's increased over the years. I've spilled out into, like I said before, into my perennial gardens and shrub borders and all that sort of thing. A lot of fun. But if you're starting just dipping your toe in and want to see how it goes, just get a large container and put it by your kitchen door. If you have a north-facing kitchen, then maybe you have an entrance door out on the south side of your house or somewhere that you can easily access it. That'll encourage you to remind you that it's there and actually use it. So this is a container that I just adored when I did it. It's full of actual herbs. And so I like to point this one out because even though it doesn't have those bright bloom colors of perennial flowers, you get a lot of color from a lot of herbs. So this happens to be herbs with a purple hue. So what you have spilling over in the bottom is purple thyme and purple sage. And then in the back left is actually, kale. And it's not a large pot. This is a 10 to 12 inch opening on the top. And this is the kind of towards the end of summer. What you can't see is there's a purple basil towards the back on the right behind the gecko, but he's kind of been drowned out by the kale. So these are things that, if you don't really have the experience or not sure what you're doing in the ground, start out in containers. And this was just kind of accidental. I was like, oh, this all kind of goes together. Let's see what happens. So this is the end of summer, and they'll kind of stay for the space that they have. The only thing I would caution you is sometimes it's difficult to, especially in containers, to deal with things starting from seed versus actual plants. So I always recommend that if you're going to start a container full, either use nothing but seeds or nothing but plants and transplants. That way they kind of are at the same stage of growth, and then you don't have one overpowering another one as they're growing. So here we go. Let's talk herbs. Now, this part of the presentation, I'm going to be talking about individual herbs. And I will do my best to just kind of characterize them and how to use them in Minnesota yards, what they're good for culinary wise, or just little quirky things and growing tips and all that sort of thing. So before we get to the encyclopedia, we're going to just do a quick, now that you have them, what do you do with them? So I'm assuming that you're going to be so inspired by this talk that you're going to run out to the garden centers, get some seed packets, and then go to be picking them up and transplanting them in another month or so. So we have strategies for using herbs. We talked about the successive sowing, which is continuous use. So when you're successive sowing, as I talked before, where you're growing the herbs, and then you're also, it's encouraging them to use them. So when you have the herbs in your yard and in the containers, the first thing I want to do is just really encourage you to use them continuously. This is like just grab a few leaves and just start incorporating them into your home and cooking and that sort of thing with fresh herbs. There's nothing like it, and you will quickly, I hope you, as I have found over the years, it's just so much more fun when I cook in the kitchen, when I'm using my herbs from outside. So the first strategy for using herbs then is to continuously use them. A lot of the herbs respond very well to that, just plucking off a few leaves here and there. And then they are encouraged and they respond to that by giving you more product and their growth habit. And then there are a few herbs that it does benefit to wait, and then you want to all at once harvest them. So it's the leaves here and there, but then all of a sudden, if you're backed up into September and there's a frost forecast and you're looking at all your herbs going, uh-oh, I haven't gotten around quite to using them, and there's a lot I'm going to lose when it gets frozen, what do I do with? So we'll talk about that as well. And that's what I call the all at once harvest, which means, you know, yanking them and bringing it all inside and trying to figure out where do we go from here. So when we're talking about harvesting herbs, and this of course is after the growing season, and we're talking fall time, and we are talking in general before and not letting the herbs freeze. I don't really know of any herbs offhand that benefit from going through a freeze, and there's an awful lot of them that will not be worth harvesting if you do let them freeze. So we want to start watching in September for those couple of nights usually that come through that it's going to get dipped down into a good frost. In that case, you can do one of two things. One, you can harvest and bring the whole plant inside to deal with, or you can try and cover it and just get through that period of time and kind of protect it through the night, all right? But in general, if we're just talking about harvesting, we want to do it, and this is kind of important, and it sounds kind of strange, but it really is something that you want to keep in mind. In morning, when the dew is dried. So if you think about that, like mid-morning, 9 to 10, depending on how much sun is hitting your yard, when that dew dries and everything is dried up, that's the perfect time to go harvest your herbs. And why is that? Well, it's actually because the oils and the essential oils in the herbs are completely distributed throughout the plant, and all of the plant stems, tissues, leaves, all the way out to the tips of the leaves. And when the dew dries around that mid-morning time frame, that's when they're completely distributed. After that point, as the sun rises in the sky and it heats up and gets hotter, the essential oils start retreating, you know, and it starts to come back down into the main stems. And so we want those essential oils and all that flavor out into the leaves. And that's the optimal time. And I often tell people, if they have some sort of garden party where, and they've been busy running around, or they're at work and then they're coming home and they're like, shoot, I need some basil. What am I going to do? It's not mid-morning, like Shari said. I always say just grab a few extra leaves of something. So just recognize that you can get away with a little bit less if you follow that mid-morning, but if not, just add a few extra leaves in. You generally want to harvest herbs and before the plant flowers and before it gets to the flowering stage, because that is going into the reproductive cycle. And once it does that, oftentimes, with few exceptions, the flavor will change. So this one's a kind of important one. So you want to remember, if you see the plant flowering, that's going to alter the flavor. And I always say, just taste it. It's not going to hurt you to taste it or anything like that. But if you like the flavor at that point, then go ahead and use it. But sometimes it just kind of puts it off a little bit and you're like, gosh, that sort of tastes like whatever herb, but not really. Chances are good that's because it's gone into the reproductive cycle, and we want to prevent that. The other tip I would give you is sometimes we get those cute little plants and we're like, oh, when can I start getting at it? And I would say you need to kind of keep the integrity of the plant. So a good 1/2 foot, 6 to 8 inches tall, let it get that, because then its root system can establish. And at that point, it can support you pinching off and grabbing a few leaves here and there from it. That would be the smallest that I would ask for before you start your harvest off of any individual herb. And then if you're going to, the next one, if cut it all, leave 2 inches to regenerate. This is talking about those herbs such as chives, where it's kind of a haircut. You can just cut it almost down and then it will regenerate. It is one of our perennial herbs in Minnesota. We'll talk about that in specific, but if you're going to cut it all down, and these are talking about our perennials, then yeah, you need to leave some leaf material on top to just regenerate and come back before we go into our lovely winters. And then just a tip about the short life cycle versus perennial makes a difference. So we need to understand our herbs. Some of the herbs, and this is of course talking specifically to Minnesota gardening, Minnesota has a very short growing period. And so a lot of our herbs that we are growing in Minnesota are actually perennials, but we function and we treat them as annuals, which means you plant them. And then once a frost comes in the fall, it's done. And we don't try and keep it alive to come back the next year. And so that short life cycle makes a difference on how you're using it versus a perennial, because the perennial herbs that will make it through our Minnesota winters and come back and be a part of your landscaping, those are the ones that you want to watch and not take as much plant material from, basically because we want to have them come back year after year. So you don't want to, take them back so far that they can't recover. So if you have any questions about any of this, I could be contacted offline. Jan's got my information and I love to chat with, or there is a lot of resources out there and books that you can start looking at different herbs after this presentation is done, which would be super fun if you end up starting a love affair with herbs as I have. And then I wanted to just point out that you can harvest seed as well for herbs. A lot of herbs will give you seed. If they do, then and you want to gather it and start generating your own herbs off of the seed, just a note to store it in a cool, dark place. And I use coin envelopes, those old-fashioned yellow envelopes that you put coins in to take to the bank. I really don't like the idea of sealing up plastic baggies, which seems logical, but there's no airflow in it. They don't breathe. Plastic doesn't breathe. So if you are forced to dealing with plastic storage of any sort, I recommend that there's some kind of leave a corner open if you can, or have it be able to breathe and don't seal it off completely. And that's kind of why our seed packets come in those paper packets. Yeah, so that's the seed. The other tip I'll tell you about harvesting for seed, you want to get seed when it's ripe, and that generally means when it's about to drop off of the plant into the ground naturally is about when you'd want to harvest the seed. So start looking for it after it's about to kind of die and lose its seed. And if you gently shake the plant, sometimes the seeds will start falling out. That's the kind of time you're looking for in a very general kind of way, in a primer kind of way for harvesting seed. And then we're going to talk through preserving. And the first method is the hanging method. This is one of the easiest and old-fashioned methods out there, which is basically just take the herbs, harvest it, and then you're going to tie it into small bunches. I use a rubber band, and then you turn them upside down, and then you hang them in a dry, warm place. A lot of times that'll be a laundry room or someplace with good air circulation, never into direct sun. That'll just desiccate the stems. And what we're trying to do when we're hanging them upside down is trying to get all those essential oils to go down and stay in the leaves until they dry. Thyme, anything with tiny leaves, sometimes is better to put into a paper lunch bag. I've dried thyme many times, and that was not a pun, and just did it upside down with the hanging method. And then a breeze comes through as I opened a door, and all the leaves blow off when it's just about ready, and it's ready to harvest, and it's finished. That's not fun. So if you place those kinds of things into a paper lunch bag, a brown paper bag, and don't overfill it because you need air circulation and you need to let it dry thoroughly. So that works, because then as it's falling off of the stems, it's being gathered at the same time. And then just a note that preserving in this method usually takes a couple of weeks, and it's very important that the leaves must be crisp. So if they're still flexible, they're not preserved yet. And this is a big one for sage. Sage takes a long time to dry out. And I've actually had friends come over and they said, hey, what's going on here? And it's moldy inside of the bag. They just harvested it too. They followed all the right steps, but they didn't let it go long enough. And then the leaves were just flexible, and then they had too much moisture still in them, and they developed mold. So just be careful. So that's a good tip. If they're crisp, they are done. And then once they are done, you can put them in jars. If you crumble the leaves, or plastic baggies is fine. And you just keep them with your other herbs. I do this all the time, and just up in my storage cabinet where I cook. And then I'm reaching for them just like I'm reaching for other herbs in the little jars that you buy at the grocery store. And then shelf life, this is an often asked question, and that's in general for dried herbs of any kind, it's best used within the year. So, and a lot of times that's just open it up, smell it. Can you smell the herb that you think is in there? And that will tell you, yes, I can smell, and it is thyme that I'm smelling. Well, then go ahead and use it. If you don't smell anything, you're not going to taste it either. Okay. All right, here we go. My favorite preserving method is the freezing method. And that is that you just take your herbs, and this works really well for that all at once harvest in the fall. You just bring all your plant material in, your herbs, and you're going to wash them, clean them, dry and freeze them in plastic bags or containers of any kind. What I often use, and my favorite and preferred method for most of the herbs, is to make a slurry out of it. And so if you have ever made pesto, this is a slurry is the same thing. It's on its way to pesto, but the slurry is just a straight herb material in an in a water or an oil, and it's a ratio. And I like that because then I can just freeze it, and then I can pop out the amount I need. And if I'm going to make pesto, I can take it on and add in the cheese and things that don't freeze so well, but it's up to you. So I recommend for the slurry, I use ice cube trays to freeze in, and then pop it out and store it in plastic bags. And then I've put on the screen here, you can make a base, a slurry, out of almost anything. And there's a real easy ratio. It's 2 cups of leaves to 1/2 a cup of oil. You do that in the food processor, and then it becomes you know, a mixture that you can pour into ice cube trays. And of course, if you want to do it in water, you can substitute the oil for water. And then just a real quick note, and I'll linger on this screen for just a quick second about some of the best herbs to do this and to freeze with. I will also say that the freezing method with parsley freezes beautifully well. And sometimes what I'll do is just freeze it on sheet trays, you know, like cookie sheets. And I'll literally just get the parsley and I'll put it on the trays and I'll just throw it in the freezer and let it freeze. And then I will put it in a container and, you know, it doesn't need to be taken to a slurry, but you can for sure. And it's beautiful. It retains its green color and it just looks still like parsley, even though it's completely frozen. That's a fun one. All right, here's the fun part. We're going to go right into which ones. So now we've talked about how to grow it, where to grow it, when to grow it, and now we're going to talk about which herbs. So I'll just go through this. This is one of my favorite herbs. I have it in my own yard, in a home landscape. It actually acts similar to this garden. This is out at Umore Park in Rosemount at Master Gardener Research and Education Display Gardens. And the white material in the background, the forefront is basil, and behind it is anise hyssop in full bloom. This is a cultivar called snow spike, so it flowers white. And you might be familiar with another hyssop that is really popular, and that's lavender hyssop. So this is a little taller than lavender hyssop. It's going to get 3 to 4 feet tall, and it acts as a great hedging material. It's got that lovely anise or licorice kind of scent to it. And these flower spikes can actually be used to be chopped up and put into cakes or cookies or whatever. I often recommend a lemon cake with these about a cup of these flower blossoms put into a lemon cake batter. It is really a lovely, lovely dessert to do. And this is a great landscaping plant. It can make it through the harsh Minnesota winters. It is very attractive to pollinators. And like I said, it's a pretty sturdy plant. It's not fussy. I have it in very poor compacted soil on the side of my house as kind of a hedge between my house and the neighbor's house. It is just lovely. And it works really, really well. And yeah, I highly encourage that. But like I said, there's different hyssops that you can get at if you don't prefer the white color. Look, and you might want to think about the lavender hyssop, which is the purpley color. And this is the king of herbs, right? Basil. I'm going to show you a couple of different pictures of the basil and why. But we're talking about basil is just that quintessential, if you're going to start off with fresh herbs and cooking and just dealing with incorporating a fresh herb into your life. Basil is readily available at the grocery store. In fact, a lot of times they'll have fresh plants. And what you can do is just take it home and have it growing. I have one at home now that I got in January that I harvested off of for a recipe. And I encourage it under bright lights, the sunniest conditions in my home, and keep that growing and limping through until we get into warmer weather. A couple of things about basil. There's a picture on the right. That is a picture of a basil flower. That is what you do not want. That will alter the flavor. It indicates the basil has gone into a reproductive cycle and so we want the green leaves only. So if you start seeing that little flower stalk starting, you just gently pinch it back. And so that's the big tip about basil. A couple other things about basil. Basil is one of the exceptions for herbs. It likes pretty good soil and it likes a little bit more water, and it can benefit from a little bit of fertilizer, not straight on a lot, but a little bit. So those are some growing tips for it. It also, if you pinch off, and the more you use basil, the more it will give back. So you want to be pinching down a branch, several leaves at a time. The leaves come in pairs. So as you pinch off, always leave a couple of sets of leaves on a branch. But when you pinch off, it'll give, instead of growing back 2 leaves, it'll grow back 4 leaves. So the more you pinch, the bushier a plant you're going to get, and you'll be doubling the production of the plant every time you pinch back. So this is something when you're growing basil, please use it continuously. Definitely a good candidate for that. Most of the varieties of basil on the market, they're vast and a lot of fun. So there's the green Genovese and sweet basil that we all know and love. I grow purple basil varieties in my yard every year, and that's super fun. It has the same kind of flavor, but just a different color. So it works very well when you're growing a lot of herbs, and having that purple kind of foliage is really fun. And then there's all sorts of lemons and limes and all kinds of things. I also want to point out for basil, another tip I'd give you is I have Japanese beetles in my yard, and they love to get on the big fat Genovese, big huge basil leaves. So I have found that when I'm growing purple basil and some of the finer, smaller basils that have smaller leaves, the Japanese beetles are just too big to really be attracted to those. So even though they can smell it, they're not going to be climbing around eating your leaves. So if you have problems with Japanese beetles, I'd recommend looking at some of the more compact varieties. There's also a lot of varieties in basil that are bred for containers specifically. So you can quite successfully grow basil. This is a container I did some years ago. And the big Genovese or sweet salad basil in the back, you have a compact, small, fine leaf basil in the front left. And that's kind of what I'm talking about. The Japanese beetles won't touch that. Then there's a purple basil and some lemon or lime that's the lighter colored in the middle. Just lovely plants in general, work well anywhere in your yard, or just all by themselves in a container. Don't be afraid to put them in. That's about a 14-inch opening, I believe. And I've got 4 or 5 basil plants in there. All right, just a nod to bay. Bay is a wonderful herb. We can't deal without it. Unfortunately, in Minnesota, we cannot overwinter it outside. This is a plant that you'd want to have in a container and bring it inside if you're going to try and grow it. In terms of harvesting bay, you want to harvest those leaves, but you also want to let them dry out. Do not use fresh basil. It needs to dry before you use it in cooking. Borage is one of my favorites. This is a great pollinator plant. It really helps your soil. If you struggle with your soil, it can help enrich and change it and condition it for you. And look at that lovely plant. Its nickname is the cucumber plant. These nodding blue flowers are absolutely stunning in the garden. Great pollinators, and they're edible. These little flowers are edible, and highly recommended. It's an easy one to just get by seed, and scatter them in your yard. They're not going to take over and be super aggressive. They'll kind of wander around and pop up here and there. So just a fun thing to get a seed pack. I'm always buying seed packets of borage. It comes in this blue. If you really have an aversion to the blue, it comes in white as well, in a Bianca or a Blanca, I believe. This is I don't have pictures. Calendula is another favorite of mine. If you're kind of tired of the marigold, proverbial marigolds that a lot of people are attracted to, give calendula a try. It's wonderful. It's easy to let it wander around your yard. And when you harvest it, the flowers are edible, and you can also use the calendula plant for skin. It's great for your skin. So if you get into doing concoctions and things like that, calendula is a great one. It is an annual, so it's something you buy a seed packet, scatter it around, grow it, and then it's not going to make it through our winters here. Chamomile or chamomile, another lovely herb, more medicinal. Think of soothing and for skin as well. But in terms of growing it, we do treat it as an annual, but it will self-sow so aggressively that it will come back. And we have both the Roman chamomile and the other one, I believe it's English. But anyway, there's 2 basic varieties, and one is used actually as a ground cover, and you can use it as a lawn material. And it throws up really pretty little white with yellow flowers. And it's a great plant, but just be careful if you put it in. We used it in the garden one year, and out of a few plants, it turned into a lawn in the bed that it was in. And we had a heck of a time trying to dig it out and remove it to showcase another herb for the following year. So that one you need to do a little research on it, unless you have an area where you don't care if it kind of wanders around and gets into trouble. Next one we were talking about, of course, is chives. And chives is one of the staples in every Minnesota garden, and with good reason. So use them. What we have our pictures here on the left is our common chive. And then on the right is a garlic chive. So if you're, one's the purpley, pinkish purple, and the other one the white. This is the one we're talking about giving a haircut if you want to give it a good harvest all at once kind of thing. This is you just grab the stems and literally shear it and leave a couple of inches and it'll grow back for you. Wonderful perennial in our yards. Makes it through the winters here. If you have grown chives and you're just like waiting for me to drop the the bombshell, yes, it can be very invasive and spread like crazy. So if you want to control the chives in your yard, you need to get it before it blooms, and the blooms are going to spread those seeds. So as beautiful as the blooms are, oftentimes in cooking, we're using just the green stems. So just keep the green stems cut and do not let it go to blossom. If it does go to blossom, the good news is they're all edible. So you can add that to, salads and in your cooking as well. So just get the blooms off if at all possible, if you don't want to have a colony of garlic or common chives. And I use chives sometimes as a border. So it's got that greenish blue for the common chives, at least, and actually garlic as well. They have that greenish blue kind of fine grass-like foliage, and it's kind of fun to run those down, especially if it's not near lawn, to kind of simulate lawn or to simulate grasses. So you can think about incorporating it that way, maybe for your landscaping. Cilantro. Cilantro is a favorite. This is the #1 most troubled herb that people come up and ask me. They were telling me that they just can't grow cilantro, and I always come right back and I say, yes, you can. This is the one that's got a shorter lifespan than our very short Minnesota summers. So actually, when cilantro starts bolting and going to reproduce, so it's setting up the little flower stalks, that's because it's done. It's a very short-lived annual. This is the one that I highly recommend you successive sow. Sow a little bit in the spring, and every 2 weeks, do a little bit more and put your seeds out. Also, the other interesting thing about cilantro is if you hate cilantro, there's always a few in the crowd that just cannot stand the taste of it. That's not a preference. You're actually, you were born that way. So for those people, I am not one of those people. So I love cilantro, but there are a couple of alternatives that you can look at if you want to kind of get that cilantro flavor without feeling like you're eating a bar of soap. And on the side of this slide, you have culantro and papalo. Those are very unusual herbs, but they are like cilantro substitutes. You can look for those in seed catalogs or probably seed catalogs. I've seen them in a couple of nurseries over the years, papalo in particular, but they're not easy to find. And then cilantro, when you let it go to seed, becomes coriander. So this is one of the herbs that we have that literally the name of the plant, the seed is literally a different name. But cilantro, when it goes to seed, is coriander. This is also cilantro I let go to seed in my yard because it overwinters and it comes back up for me. So you have that option. Moving on to dill. This is a lovely one. Everybody's familiar with it. You can either use it in the green. This is the leaf material growing, and feel free to just, cut back a stem or two and use it in your cooking, particularly nice with fish and in sauces. And then, of course, when we're waiting to make our pickles in the fall, we need dill. And this is it when it's fully in bloom. It's actually a beautiful plant in bloom. So sometimes I'll just grow it and let it go to seed because it's so darn pretty. All right, this is a lesser known one. I'm going to pick up the pace a little bit. We're only in the E's and I'm not sure of where we're at with time. All right. Episode is one you'd have to get by seed. Look at it for in your garden centers and nurseries. It's the Mexican bean herb. It is something that if you grow it, you put it into any bean dish and it acts like Beano. So it takes away that gassy thing that often happens when we're eating our beans, right? So that's a natural way to control the side effects of beans. All right, this is a picture of our Master Gardener display garden, herb garden, all those years ago. And I use this one for fennel. Fennel is in the middle. If you'll zero in on the ceramic pot and the big container, dead center, to the right of it, the very tall yellow plant in full flower, that's fennel. It looks very similar to dill, and with good reason. They are pretty much cousins, and you don't want to get them growing near each other because they'll kind of cross-pollinate. And so this is fennel. It's a beautiful one. And the herb version, if you're familiar with the bulb fennel that you buy in the grocery stores to cook with, that is not this one. This is an herb version of fennel. So we are growing it for the leaf material, not the bulb. Horseradish, just nod to that. It is a perennial in Minnesota, and you harvest it in the late fall. It can be pretty aggressive. It's very coarse leaves, so you want to be careful where you put it if you want to grow it in your yard, but can do it very successfully in Minnesota yards. I have a couple of plants in my own yard, but they're kind of tucked away and they're not center stage. Yeah, not particularly attractive, but if you like horseradish, it's actually super fun to play around with, and we could do it very easily in our yards. Lavender, one of the favorites for everybody. And this is a beautiful picture. It's not in Minnesota. This is lavender is a large family. This is one that we see a lot in the inside, and it's French or Spanish lavender. It is not zone hardy here in Minnesota, but we do have a few varieties of lavender. We can grow them successfully in Minnesota gardens, and they make it through winter. Hidcote, Munstead, those are two of the old tried and true that can make it. And this is, I have grown this successfully from seed in the garden, and it flowers from seed. So if you're interested in the bloom and you don't want the expense of the plants, you can grow it from seed. And this variety, I believe, is Lady Lavender, and so that's the one that you would probably find the most easily, that if you grew it from seed the first year, it should bloom for you. Otherwise, there's a lot of treat this as a tender perennial, put it in a protected part of your yard, or be willing, or container growing and bring it in to overwinter it. Yeah, there's a lot of fun things to do with lavender. Lavender has a not very good germination rate, so we're talking 30%. So if you want one plant that you're seeding, you want to put in probably 3 seeds, to make sure you get a plant. And also lavender wants extremely well-drained soil. It's one of those wonderful Mediterranean kind of herbs that you really need to not have it in compacted clay soil or anything, almost rocky soil, and just it doesn't want its roots waterlogged at all. Definitely one to let dry out between waterings. A nod to lovage. I grow this in my garden. It's absolutely beautiful. It looks like celery, and mine grows probably 6 or 7 feet tall. So not for every garden, but a lot of fun. And if you want an herb that functions like celery, you might want to look into that. Marjoram is a tender perennial for us in Minnesota. It's a cousin to oregano, to Italian oregano, but it's got a milder flavor. So I always grow marjoram every year. I do treat it as an annual. Sometimes I'm lucky enough to get it overwintering to the next year. But for generally speaking, it's not going to survive our harsh winters, but it's got a really nice mild flavor. So in terms of culinary and things that I'm reaching for constantly, I would say marjoram and thyme are one of two of my go-tos. They kind of blend and just work well with everything. Oh, and then here we go. Mint is a lovely one. There are several mints that are hardy to Minnesota, and that's a problem. Because if you put mint in the ground, you are going to, it's pretty much a thug. It really doesn't behave well. It likes to take over things and choke out things. So I highly recommend, for whatever variety you're growing, keep it in a container and do not mix anything in the container. This is the one exception. Don't put mint with anything else. If you put one small little plant of mint, no matter the size of container, it's going to take over that container in a matter of weeks. Where you're looking at a chocolate mint, and there's a lot of flavors for mint. So just essential in a garden. This one's pineapple mint. Look at that white and green variegation with the crinkly kind of leaves. Super fun. And yes, it smells just like pine proverbial spearmint. So I have huge 2-foot wide containers, huge containers, and I'll just put one mint plant in it. If I don't want to overwinter it, I have, there's a lot of mints though that are not zone hardy. So if you do have to put a mint in the ground, I highly recommend you look for a non-zone hardy mint. And we're talking the zone 4s that Minnesota is in. Mint are orange, and chocolate's getting pretty darn close. And then spearmint, those are zone 4 hardy. So those I would never put in the ground. What I'm going to put in the ground would be like mojito, which is a zone 9 or something. And then some of your marginal, like zone 6 or zone 7. So mint is an important one. Look at the zone hardiness rating if you need to put it in the ground. Otherwise, just keep it in a container. Yeah, it's pretty aggressive, but rightly so. It's so amazing to use. And this is one where you just pick off the leaves. It generates so quickly. It's hard to use as fast as it goes, unless you're feeding crowds and crowds and crowds. Nasturtium is another favorite. The picture here is a ton of basil, and then those brightly orange flowers and those big leaves, those are nasturtium. They grow well from a seed. Lots of different patterns, variegated, different colors. Usually you're in the warm colors, yellow, oranges, reds, but a great landscaping plant again. Very fun, and the flowers are edible. So that one's a really fun one to give a go to. Oregano, we always use this in cooking. This one is very hardy to our Minnesota landscapes, and it will be aggressive like chives. It literally, here's a picture of it. In the forefront is cardoon. We decided to play with cardoon one year. And behind it, that huge big glob started out as like 3 plants the year before. So it likes to colonize and spread. And yes, it is a very close relative of mint, which is why it's so aggressive. The thing with oregano is it likes to have dry roots as well, but so you don't want soak or saturated soil at all. It's one of our exceptions though. If you let it bloom, it will not affect the flavor, it will intensify the flavor. So that's really important to know. So if you look out there, and it will bloom for you, I let it bloom in my yard because of the pollinators. This is a lovely pollinator plant and you get to use it. So if you like to cook with oregano, no need to go to the store and buy dried oregano ever again, because this plant will go and keep on going. It does like to seed. So be careful when you let it out in your yard. I've been playing with it for the last couple of years, and I have to rein it in along with my chives at certain points. Parsley, there's 2 main varieties. It's the curly, which we all know is a garnishment, wonderful source of vitamin C, very, very healthy for you. So start eating it. And then Italian flatleaf, so the longer stalks. This one is a preferred culinary variety. I grow both in my yard. I will actually use that curly parsley as a border. And I'll grow a lot of extra parsley, and that's because it's a favorite of the swallowtail butterflies. The caterpillars will climb on it and eat. It's one of the few foods it eats. So in the fall, sometimes I'll go, wow, what happened to my parsley? And then I see a cute little caterpillar, and I feel good that day. So if you like that, you're into that with the butterflies, grow extra for them. And moving on to rosemary. This is not hardy in Minnesota, but usually you can get it through the winter. It can go down to a freeze pretty easily because it's a woody stemmed. So I leave it out typically into October, November even sometimes, and then I'll bring it in or cut it in and just use it as a fresh indoor flower bouquet in water, and it will stay good for weeks. So I can get through usually the holidays, whether I'm cutting it or bringing it inside. I do not have the ability to overwinter it like some of my friends, but if you can, it's something that can go out pretty early, fairly early in the spring, like we're talking April even. Sage is another great perennial for Minnesota gardens. This one is pretty much the common garden sage, and that is the main one we use for culinary. There's a lot of sages. They're in the salvia family, and a lot of fun to play around with. But if you're talking about cooking with it, we want the garden or common sage. This will survive our winters. It will look kind of ratty after a couple of years. So you might, I always like have fresh sage going in every few years just as replacements. Yeah, but it's a great one. And who can beat this gray green foliage? It's a lovely texture plant to play off a lot of our bright green herbs. So indispensable to use in composition and colors in the landscape and stuff. It's just a gorgeous one. Here's a picture with that crazy textured leaf. This one is purple sage with all those purple tints. So just a lot of fun. This one is not particularly, it's more ornamental, and it's not an aggressive grower at all, but I usually find myself buying it every year and just treating it like an annual. This is one I'd like to point out. It's not the greatest picture. It's a container where I had a lot of odds and ends. Up the spiky stuff is lavender hyssop. Remember we talked about anise hyssop at the beginning. This is lavender, but spilling over the sides are those little fine byleaf kind of stems, and that's solid burnet. And it's a great perennial for our gardens, and it's edible. It's great in salads. And it's a lesser known herb, but one that I love and try and tell everybody about it and share the joy that I have planting it and seeing in my yards. We're almost through. Thanks for your patience. Summer savory, we've got two different savories, and one is summer and one is winter. I'll show you a picture of the winter. Summer savory is not hardy to Minnesota, but it self-seeds enough that if you dedicate a spot to it, it's well worth the effort. It will reseed for you and come back. And typically what I do is just let it come back and plant at will. And then as it's growing up and I go, oh, that's right, there was savory there last year. Just yank the plants. They're very shallow rooted and they're great. So savory is known as the pepper herb. So if you're looking for a little bit of flavor and a punch and something to kind of, pick up the pace in your cooking, savory is the one to try. You definitely want the summer savory. There's actually a short little guy that's cute and fun to grow for containers, or if you don't have a lot of space, it'll stay, like a foot tall, but typically it wants to be a 1.5 feet high. And here it's in full bloom. It reminds me a lot of rosemary, but it's not as woody and it's not so hard and it grows quickly. So highly recommend if you want to have an adventure in your kitchen, try a summer savory, pick up a seed packet, easy to grow from seed. The next slide is going to be winter savory, and this is hardy to Minnesota, so it can make it through our winters. It gets straggly looking though, and I will say that after a few years, it's going to lose its flavor, kind of like tarragon, which we'll talk about here in a minute. But definitely a consideration for a spot in your landscape if you want a culinary subshrub. But I would say the summer savory is far superior to flavor and that sort of thing. Oh, before we get to tarragon, this is stevia, and stevia has been all the rage for the last 20 years or more when it first landed, and finally landed on our shelves in the stores as Truvia or other things. But this is a sweetener. it gets in the news a lot. Sometimes you'll see it in the stores as sweet herb, but this one is a super easy one to grow, very warm climate. So start it in June, but it'll take off. This is from seed, and it's that long stocky thing in the middle between the two pots. It's literally coming over the edge of a pot and then growing all the way back up. So pretty aggressive grower. It was in a small 6 to 8 inch pot. So it gives a lot of bang for its buck. Stevia is supposed to be 500 times sweeter than cane sugar, with no calories and no rotting your teeth possibilities, because it's a green herb and green plant material. So if you just grab a couple of leaves and throw it in your cup of tea in the morning, great way to sweeten stuff. Yeah, but it will not winter in Minnesota at all. So it's definitely something try and keep inside, I guess, if you want to keep it alive. I just grow it as an annual. And that's a real close-up of the leaves. So super fun. All right, Tarragon is another subshrub for Minnesota landscapes. Highly recommend it, love it. It is one that might start losing its flavor after several years in the yard. So you can propagate off of the mother plant to get a new plant going. It's fairly easy to do. But Tarragon is just that one of those lovely flavors that you just wouldn't want to be without in your yard. And again, it's a sub-woody shrub kind of. So we're talking between that one and winter savory, kind of like the 3 footer, 3 to 4 footer, maybe maximum 3 by 3. I would probably put it at. And then indispensable in everybody. There are a lot of varieties of thyme that are hardy to Minnesota landscapes. They're very low growing, so they work well in the landscape as ground covers, between pavers, edges, just kind of where you want anything low, and you just can't get away from the flavor. Thyme is just indispensable. The premier and primary culinary varieties of thyme would be the English or the French. And those are going to be a little less zone hardy than a lot of our Minnesota thymes. So, just take a look at it, but it's really fun to grow. I always have English and French thyme, and oftentimes it will go through and make it through and survive a winter or so, but I never count on it. I'm always setting aside a little bit of my budget to buy multiple plants of thyme. I just can't not have it in the garden. It grows really, they're cute little plants. So you can intersperse them amongst other flowers and stuff like that. I usually have them right outside the garage in the front growing all by themselves. They're fun. The kind of varieties that are hardy in Minnesota are kind of woolly thyme, which is not a culinary one. Things like lemon thyme, lime, lemon lime, orange thyme. There's all kinds. So thyme is super fun to get involved with herbs. And of course, they're in bloom. So great choice for pollinators. I would not ever not have thyme in my yard. It's just a beautiful plant all around, and it's a win-win for us and the bees. All right, and I will just end really quickly with, you were given a handout or given a link to a handout. What I did in that was kind of reiterate a lot of the talking points here today, and then put about the top 10 culinary herbs in it, figuring that you'd want to resource or reference and go, what was she saying about this again, with a little bit of growing tips, and then a number of recipes. And I wanted to end today just by saying, when we're talking recipes, this is just kind of a, wow, I didn't know that, but it's really fun to think about using flowers in your garden, salads and things like that. And here's a list of edible flowers, and always be careful of your growing material if you're buying things that are in your garden centers in the flower section as opposed to the herb section. But Johnny jump ups or violas, those are edible. Nasturtiums, borage, calendula, even marigolds are. Dandelions, which we all, they're edible. Lavender blossoms and oregano blossoms, chive blossoms, all these things might really brighten up your cooking this summer. And I really appreciate the time that you guys had for me today. If you have any follow-up questions or anything like that, you can reach me through the Master Gardener program, through Dakota County and Jan And I'm really excited about 2021 in terms of gardening with herbs. So thank you very much.